acknowledge that our campus is on the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking First Nations. We call them the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations at times. And we're, of course, appreciative that we're on these lands. We work very hard to partner with our First Nations neighbors, and they are very gracious to allow us to continue to operate as a university and learn and teach and research here on these lands. Beautiful campus. I'll show you a little bit more, but we always want to start by talking about the fact that, you know, we have quite a checkered history at Royal Roads in terms of the lands. It was very much colonized by the Dunsmuirs, who were coal barons, and then it became the Department of National Defense location and a military college. And so we have it all going on. We've got this big colonial artifact of a castle square in the middle of our campus, but it's a constant reminder that even though we may not be personally responsible for the harms inflicted on our First Peoples, we are directly responsible for reconciling our values of respect, dignity, peace with our practice. I always like to showcase the campus a little and invite you to come and visit us. We're on 300 hectares of old growth forest. We look out across the Harrow Strait to the Olympic Mountains. We're just the most fortunate people really to be operating. We have a number of different kinds of gardens, the Japanese and Italian, again, all inherited from the Dunsmuir estate. And there's our beautiful little castle where, of course, Deadpool has been filmed and many other X-Men movies. But this is really about sport. These webinar episodes are all about the way that sport connects to different aspects of our society. And I always say that there's a lot of truth in sport. Sport has a great deal to teach our communities. We've seen, and I'm so proud of our athletes for using their platform to speak up and out about different issues that concern human beings and the environment and all creatures really across the world through the platform of sport. It's the most engaging, most watched, most participated in human endeavor in the world. And so, you know, it has a lot of power. We have a lot of power through sport to do things well. And when sport's delivered effectively, it can teach us so many wonderful things about communication and connection and diversity and acceptance, belonging. We acknowledge and partner with Game Plan, actually, so we welcome athletes into our university and acknowledge the professional experience they've garnered through sport, just like we would with anyone who's got professional experience. We count it for credit. We offer sport leadership courses in partnership initially with the CFL Players Association, but they then expanded it to all sorts of other player associations. So I had about 19 students in my last course from about 8 different sports. Great to see. But here we are in this webinar series. Every month or so, we try and talk about a prescient issue that connects to social change, which is what Royal Roads is all about. We have 7 schools, all very interdisciplinary, that all work for us in kind of a social purpose manner to affect positive social change across the world. And sport, of course, connects to a lot of these kinds of concepts. I invite you to post your questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that. I have no problem just watching what's poking up in the chat as we go along. And sometimes I invite people to join into the conversation. We're going to be talking about, of course, this idea that yes, we can fight for human rights through sport, and we've often seen people do that, but that really shouldn't sport be, as an education, shouldn't it also be considered a human right, something that everybody has access to, the right really to play? And if we think about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, where it is framed that way, that sport really is a right, we want to welcome our 3 amazing guests today. We'll start with Minky Worden, an American human rights advocate and author, serves as Director of Global Initiatives at Human Rights Watch, developing and implementing international outreach and advocacy campaigns. And she's been an adjunct associate professor at Columbia for many years in public affairs. She previously served as Human Rights Watch's media director. So there's that connection with communication. The other, role I play in communication and culture, sport again has such a great impact in terms of outreach, but also within sport, right? We're constantly having to learn the art and science of communication. And Minky also speaks and writes on the topics of political prisoners, women's rights, and human rights in sport. We've got Mac Ross, who is the McCain and McLean Center for Sport Business and Health Fellow at St. Mary's University and chair of both the Rights and Responsibilities Awareness Initiative and the Canadian Collective for Human Rights in Sport. And Ige Egal, founder and CEO of Play for Dignity, a national nonprofit reimagining Canada's sports system through a human rights-based approach. His work spans grassroots sport and international public policy with a focus on building systems that reflect dignity, equity, and access. I've been just so privileged to get to know Ige in many conversations we've had about different projects we're working on and how we can intersect. He's also a Métis Fellow and serves on the board of the MLSE Launchpad. Worth exploring, actually. We'll put that link to Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment Launchpad as well into our chat, but also we'll post it on our website, and you can find everybody online, of course. And let's get started. So welcome, everybody, and good to see some of my previous students. Always great to see Walter Martindale getting in there in the lineup right at the very beginning. Nice to see you, Walter, and a previous coach of mine when I was a kid. All right, so let's start. I always like to invite everybody to first start by telling us a little bit more about your background. I've given a brief intro, but tell us more about your path into sport. Why sport? Why is it still so important for you? Why is it something that you're devoting a lot of your professional life to? Yeah, who would like to start? Go ahead, Minky. Yeah, and just turn your mic on anytime you want to break into, and I'll monitor that, make sure I facilitate.
Well, with your incredible windup, I'm so excited to share a little bit about my background and the work that we're doing at Human Rights Watch to advance human rights in and through sport. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is. But just on a personal level, I'm born in 1967, so I'm a child of Title IX. And, but even so, a lot of sports simply weren't available. I played on the boys soccer team. AYSO had boys teams, not girls teams. And, in high school, I played literally every sport every season because that was essentially a way to get out of gym class. But sport was also a very important social connector for me. I grew up in East Tennessee where girls didn't have a lot of opportunities, and sport really gave me a chance to broaden my horizons. I've seen it play that role for a lot of people, but I think we also have to, when we talk about sport as a force for good, I think we also have to recognize you spoke about power and the power of sport. And I think we also have to say that sport, uh, almost more than anything else, has a lot of power differentials embedded into it. And we can talk a little bit more about what those are. But the actors in sports, governments have enormous power. When they host events, it can contribute to enormous harms. So I got involved. I've been at Human Rights Watch for more than 27 years, but I did a book on the Beijing Olympics back in 2008. And we were able to document the harms, both to people within China and then to athletes and others outside. And the same thing for the Russian Olympics, the Russia World Cup, the Brazil World Cup, the Brazil Olympics, the Qatar World Cup, and the second Beijing Olympics, the Winter Olympics. And essentially all of these events have in common that if there aren't human rights protections, whatever the pre-existing human rights problems are, if it's modern day slavery, if it is discrimination and hatred against LGBT people, if it is a lack of poor pay or no pay for women athletes, these mega events will exacerbate. So when we talk about advancing human rights in sport and through sport, we focus on access, which is in many parts of the world, women and girls and LGBT people can't play sports at all. Safety, there's been a particular problem and the power imbalance that leaves open the opportunity for sexual, physical, verbal, emotional, and other abuse. And then finally, equality, the lack of fair pay or equal pay for among genders. So those are some of the issues that animate me, that make me excited about this work. I would say the most important thing is working directly with athletes, including survivors of abuse, including athletes who are fighting every day for rights that they already have, but they are forced to fight for those rights. So that's a short introduction.
Thank you so much. And I'll post a little link to Minky's book as well. Great points that we'll dig into. How about Ige next, and then we'll finish off with Matt. Go ahead, Ige.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer, and good day, everybody. My name is Ige Gal. My introduction into sport really started, let's just say, organized sport, for instance, started when I moved to Canada in the winter of 1995. So my first summer was 1996, watching the Olympics at home. It really didn't occur to me that there was a way where I was living to be able to participate in any way in some of the things that I was seeing on screen. But it was also a moment as a new immigrant to Canada to be able to watch people who looked like me in the relay, the 1996 relay team win, just kind of sparked something in me. And it was summer, and that summer I spent indoors, not being able to participate in organized sport. But years later, I had what I would call a life-changing invitation when I was not only invited to play at a soccer club, but was also given an opportunity to have my first job as a referee, a job that I would keep for 12 years, which has been the longest job I've ever kept, and has provided me a lifelong journey in sport, learning critical skills, being able to meet friends and build community really through sport. And it's been something that since those first experiences has stayed with me. And so I really have experienced kind of not necessarily the high performance nature of sport. I always joke I was a better referee than a soccer player, but all of the benefits that come along with it. And that led me to an opportunity, when I was just a couple of years out of university, to build a rugby program that used rugby as a tool for community development. Now, I'd never played rugby, but my friends who had invited me to work on this program said, "Oh, it's rugby is just a tool. What we're doing is providing employment, leadership development, academic support through this game to many of the young people in Toronto's priority neighborhoods that were underserved." That's all really, my friends needed to say, because I knew something about using sport as a tool for community and human development. I was a result of that. So that came to be an opportunity that I would take advantage of for 7 years. And after 7 years of really working at the grassroots, using sport as a community development tool, some of the challenges that we were coming up against in our sport ecosystem were fundamentally challenges that were beyond the scope of a grassroots organization to address, but that did impact many communities across the country in how sport was experienced or not experienced at all. So that experience and that opportunity led to essentially the emergence of Play for Dignity. In 2020 and beyond, we've seen the many headlines in sport that speak to this this darkness in sport. Minky mentioned there's this power of sport, but it's a duality. There's a power and a darkness, and the difference in how those experiences are felt is how intentional we can be in how we design our sport systems. And so thinking about those challenges, Play for Dignity has emerged to use a human rights-based approach to try and address some of the cultural and institutional challenges that we find in the sport ecosystem. And that includes using, the rights the right to sport, rights through sport, and rights in sport, which is sort of the three different layers that we work across.
Thank you. And Mac?
Yeah, so my name is Mac Ross. I grew up in Nova Scotia in Canada. My journey into sport is very much just a matter of having something to do. So I grew up in a village of about 800 people, and all we did was play outside, whether it was swimming. We grew up on the sea, or playing basketball outdoors, or playing more organized sports like we had ice hockey teams and soccer teams and things like that. But one of the things that was readily apparent was also the lack of different sporting opportunities based on where we lived. If you wanted to play certain sports or try them, you had to literally drive over a mountain an hour away. So we played what we could, and we loved the sports we had. But I was very aware that especially when the Winter Olympics rolled around, that I can't go do bobsled, or these things are not available to me, and I wish they were. I am very passionate about sport. I wouldn't say I'm a champion of sport. I'd say I'm an optimistic critic of sport. Um, Probably the most significant work I've done to date in the realm of human rights was to help organize Scholars Against Abuse in Canadian Sport, where over 100 academics from across Canada, dozens of universities and colleges, but then also from Brazil, Australia, England, Scotland, France, all over the place, lent their expertise to kind of take a look at what was happening in Canadian sport in terms of the abuse crisis what we had always faced, but we were coming to terms with in a very public, systematic way up at Parliament and the House of Commons, where more and more every week was coming out and things were looking darker and darker. And we looked at some of the solutions that were being offered up, and we were a little bit concerned. And we thought that the structure of sport in Canada was not well suited to fix itself. That money being funded in and around, from the Heritage Canada down to Sport Canada down to the organizations, and then also over to the bodies responsible for addressing harm and trauma. It was really complicated, and there was a lot of opportunity there, or risk, I guess, for some conflict of interest and things to go sideways, and they ultimately did. And now we're trying something new, and we'll see how that goes. But a lot of it will be trying things and trying to find the right fit for the nation with the system that we have. Like I said, I played hockey, softball, baseball, but I took up a particularly controversial sport in university in boxing, which may or may not be a human rights violation in itself, depending on where it's being conducted. So I often have really interesting discussions with students and colleagues. So, how can you possibly do that? And I do have an answer, but I'll save that for later if anybody's interested. Most of my work appears in history journals. I take a very historical approach to things. I think that much of the struggle we face today, to understand it, we have to understand the convergence of forces over time, economic, social, political. They all come together and create a mess, and somewhere in the middle of that, sport finds itself kind of muddling along. And I guess other than that, I'm really passionate about teaching. I'm also the chair of the Canadian Collective for Human Rights in Sport, but I've taught at schools in America and Canada, Keystone College in the States, but St. Francis Xavier, Western, Windsor, and now St. Mary's in Halifax. So I've been at big schools, little schools. I've seen all different sorts of sports departments, which is really interesting. And I do my very best to support athletes and survivors whenever they come forward, which has on occasion put me in some tight spots at my own universities. So, um, when you're going to tackle human rights, you have to be willing to tackle them at your own institution as well. Otherwise, you're a hypocrite and a collaborator, and can't have that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all the work all three of you are doing, to help so many people, really. And you all have mentioned things like power, and I loved your description there, Mac, of being an optimistic critic. I think that is a good way to put it. Why is sport so important? Why is it captivating all of us? I mean, all four of us. I think I've gotten pulled more and more into the sport world, partly because of the crises we're seeing, but also just because I love it so much, and I know it has so much potential to teach us so many good things, So what is it that captivates you and keeps you going? Because sometimes I feel like I'm so tired, but I'm sure you all feel that way too. Yeah. What keeps you going? Ige.
Yeah, I think, I think about the joy one experiences when playing or participating in sport that is done well, and that includes as a spectator, right? And so that joy is what draws us to sport, whether it's our own personal experiences or those of those closest to us. And so if we can think about a way that we can ensure that stays prescient, that stays present in how our system is organized, I think we have a lot to build on. But at the same time, it is, when you think about why this draws not just all of us, but our societies as a whole, it is play and sport is really how we've come together to learn, to connect with one another, to exchange, and to build cohesion and community. We're talking about these things now as an added layer to sport when you think about sport for development or sport for social good, but essentially that's at the core when you have communities come together to play with one another, to have competition in an organized way. So I think that's partly why it draws us and why it has also become such an economic powerhouse, right? You have a lot of people who are interested in spectating and watching, and so I think this is what's at the crux of it. But it's important to keep in mind, both as Minky and Mac have mentioned, is that it is a mirror of our current societies. And so whatever it is, the challenges that we're facing in our current societies, they are likely to replicate themselves on the field of play, so to speak. So how do we ensure that we're cognizant of that, but also try to address those challenges as well?
Thank you.
Yeah. I would echo the centrality of play to the human condition, whether it's sport or dance or a game you made up. It's something that connects people across time and space and culture. We all do it. And there's a lot of things we don't all do, but we do in some form or another. We all play. But I wanted to pick up on something Jen said about feeling exhausted, and how frustrating all of this can be. I think one of the ways you can tell how important it is to people is that they stay with it. They maintain their resistance to the point of exhaustion, where they feel just downtrodden by the whole thing, that they feel desperate to make change. And one of the people I draw heavily upon is Camus, the French philosopher, kind of trying to make sense of French society at the end of World War II. And one of the things he just kept on coming back to was, if we're going to keep keep up this resistance to political ideas and actions that are really anti human, that really are quite dangerous and can wipe out whole groups of people and suppress ideas and our movement and all the kinds of things that are held up under the UN conventions. Um, we have to recognize there's going to be a point where we get really tired, and that this is a long-term project. And um, somehow I think acknowledging that in advance is really powerful. So that when you come up to that point and like, okay, I've been emailing MPs for 2 years and nothing's changing. No one really seems to listen. Um, you sit back and say, okay, this is all part of it. It's okay. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep moving forward because he wrote the myth of Sisyphus.
Right.
Pushing the rock all the way up just for it to come all the way back down. And he always encouraged us to think, imagine him happy. He's resisting through pushing that rock up. Yeah, he's condemned to do it over and over again, but he's doing a really good job of it. He's doing it and he's scorning everybody who thinks that he's miserable because he's happy doing it. And I think if you are passionate about sport and you really do want it to change and you recognize that there are really big issues at a systemic level that go beyond sport too, like Minky was saying, then I think you can take solace in the fact that your resistance is worthwhile even when you feel exhausted.
Yeah, it's just like sport, right? I mean, we enter a contest, a race, some sort of endeavor in sport, and you're going to be pushing, right? How much pain will eventually come. I used to row, so at the end of that 2K, you're just about ready to go blind. Minky, what do you think? What keeps you going?
Yeah, just picking up on some themes that Mac and Ige that set out. I think so sports represents in a lot of ways the best of humanity. We know people have to work very hard. And indeed, I think it's really important and maybe something we should return to that for many people, sport is a job, right? It's a job as an athlete, a job as a coach, a referee, official. So, and a lot of people, and sport is also a multi-trillion-dollar business as well. So I think when we say, when we talk about the joy of sports, we should also acknowledge we love watching sports. I don't want to be a wet blanket. But both the Olympics and the summer and winter Olympics and the World Cup, the Women's World Cup, these are multi-billion person audiences. So you have these mega events, and then you have, national, state, and local, right down to, I'm gesturing out the window at our baseball diamond. And I think, we've got a baseball diamond in Lower Manhattan. I think, we have to deal with sport on all of these levels. Because if it's a job and there's workplace harassment, well, that's a violation of workers' rights. If you're a worker from South Asia building a stadium in Saudi Arabia for the World Cup and you die falling from the stadium, that happened recently, the first death building the 2034 World Cup in Saudi Arabia. That's a workers' rights violation. The family needs compensation. They won't have a breadwinner. That the children of that worker will grow up without a parent. And I think so we have to temper our joy and our love for sport with a recognition that it's a really uneven playing field. And I think, a lot of the challenges have been how to even that playing field for these groups that I just mentioned. And Human Rights Watch is part of a really important initiative called the Sport and Rights Alliance. And that is, I mentioned that because it's Human Rights Watch is one of the partners, along with our cousins at Amnesty International, the Army of Survivors, which is a group of athletes advocating for their own rights, the Committee to Protect Journalists, ILGA World, Athlete Ally, the ITUC representing workers and trade unions, World Players. So I think if we think of all of these sectors who are, and these are both sectors, but also individuals who are really affected by the business of sports, or the practice of sports, then we, we should definitely celebrate. Let's enjoy cheering the champions, but then we should also remember there are a lot of losers in sports, and the human rights movement has been working for several decades to level that playing field for all of those actors in sport. So anyone who gets involved, particularly if it's your job, in the same way you have a right not to be harassed at your workplace anywhere in the world, you really shouldn't be harassed, abused, cheated of your wages in sport either. So that ending that normalization of abuse in sport, actually, Human Rights Watch did a report on on Japan, interviewing 800 athletes from 50 sports. That was both summer and winter Olympic sports, and in 47 prefectures. So it was a very comprehensive report. And the words that I heard over and over again were shogunai, that's a word for normalization in Japanese. And it just means that abuse in sport is utterly normalized. And that is true not just of Japan, but of many places around the world. And that's one of the things that we really have to tackle.
That's for sure. And again, just like sport, right? We can't enter into sport naively or like Pollyanna, assuming it's all going to be wonderful. I think of times I've played whatever sport, and the other team starts cheating, and you can get all indignant and waste a lot of energy being frustrated or reacting, but really you just need to hunker down, accept the fact, and carry on, right? And play well and play clean, and not succumb to the whatever kind of behaviors, right? But also be aware enough to now bring it to the attention of those powers that you mentioned that could perhaps, like Ige was talking about, maybe not at grassroots, but we need to bring it to those who can actually address the imbalances in terms of rules and balancing out the field, right? And you see kids do that so beautifully. Like they notice when one of them has a big advantage over the other. You watch a couple of kids playing, basketball or something, and the older, stronger, taller kid will kind of will handicap themselves a bit, right? In order to allow it to be a balanced game. They know. They're teaching us all the time. All right. So sport has been framed in lots of different ways. We in Canada have seen it, move from ministry to ministry, right? It's health one minute, then it's something else, and now it's heritage. And it just gets flung around, and it makes me kind of crazy. Personally, I think it belongs in education, but it's also now we're talking about it as a human right. What makes it, in your opinion, something people should have access to, the right to? Minky, go ahead.
Maybe as the professional human rights activist on the meeting today, I'll take that one. And it's something we've really, I think it's actually a rather new understanding. And for many decades, the Olympic Charter said sport is a human right. Well, it said that at a time when many national teams kept sending either all white teams or all male teams. So it said the Olympic Charter was not being upheld for many years, and when in practice, women and girls and LGBT people and others were excluded from sport. So I think it's been an aspiration for a long time, but just in how it's grounded in human rights, there are a few things, and you mentioned the word of framework for Canada to understand. Yeah, there is a operative framework, and that framework is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is entirely appropriate because sport is a business. All of the sports federations are enterprises. Many of them, think of FIFA or cricket, are very wealthy. And they have employees, they have workers, and they have obligations to athletes, fans, and others. So the framework is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and that requires that you do human rights due diligence, right? Make sure that your event or your staff are not causing human rights harms. If you're going to a place that already has a problem with forced labor, will your event exacerbate that? The other requirements are monitoring. So, for example, when Beijing was awarded the Winter Olympics in 2015, that was before 1 million Uyghurs were put into forced re-education through labor camps, right? So the conditions on the ground can change in ways that imperil human rights. You have an obligation to remedy. So if a worker dies building your stadium, you have an obligation to pay compensation to the family and make sure the children aren't forced into child labor. And then finally, transparency. And this is the hardest thing for a lot of sports bodies because whatever they do wrong, they definitely want to keep it secret. Whether it's corruption, whether it's human rights abuse, whether it's human trafficking. So, and these are all things that when you hear me saying those words ought to be antithetical to sport. Every single thing I've just said should have nothing to do with sport. And yet these are major crises within sport. But I just, on the positive side, I wanted to say that sport also attaches to the right to education. If you think of how many scholarships are given for those from impoverished communities who might not be able to afford an education, or women and girls. I know that we have on the line the great Friba Rezai, who has arranged scholarships. She herself is an Olympian and has arranged scholarships for women and girls from Afghanistan to guarantee them the education that the Taliban has wrongfully taken from them. And sports is a business. Think about, it's a multi-trillion dollar business. So if women and girls are banned from playing sport, for example, as they were for many years in Saudi Arabia, that running a gym is a business, running a sports team is a business. So these are business opportunities. Athleisure wear is a business. So if you're banned from playing sports, as women and girls are in Afghanistan, for example, you're also not able to have a job. You're denied the right to have a business. So the main rights that are tied very closely to sports are education, economic rights, and of course the right to health, to good health, which you can achieve if you're allowed to play sports.
Love it. Thank you. Other comments? Matt, go ahead.
I would just add maybe to Minky's list the cultural rights as well. Under the conventions for economic, social, and cultural rights, and then civil and political rights too. Both are clear about the right for people to be able to participate in cultural life. And not everybody, sometimes we get this weird dichotomy, especially in academia, where culture is opera and literature and things like that. When really there is a much broader definition of culture that can be deployed, which would include sport and physical culture, and things like that. And these are old governments. Like, they should have been protected for decades, and they haven't been. And that's one of the things we noticed in Canada as well with Indigenous peoples. Well, no, these rights were always supposed to be protected. The Canadian government just decided they weren't going to do it. So the right to have adequate health care, the right to make sure that your children can be healthy, through Jordan's principle, for example. All those things should have already existed, the second that these conventions were ratified, but Canada didn't do it and continued to postpone and postpone. And only relatively recently did they agree to sign and ratify the Declaration for Indigenous, or the Rights of Indigenous People, which within it it re-emphasizes many of the rights that we were already supposed to be following, which includes, like Minky was saying, their right to the highest standards of healthcare within the, like anybody else. And one of the things that we've been talking a lot about in our group for human rights, is depending on the country, right? Sport in the Eurocentric, capacity for sport, the thought of sport as like athletics and things like that, that is relevant within the Canadian context, but it might not be relevant everywhere. And different physical activities and physical cultures need to be recognized as well as a human right. But within the Canadian context, because sport is such a central player in getting people physically active, it's one of the primary things we encourage people to do to stay fit and healthy, both mentally, physically, socially. Everybody has to have access to the same sporting opportunities. And so through some of the policies and legislation that apply to Indigenous peoples in Canada, for example, court rulings about Jordan's Principle, which is supposed to make sure that Indigenous children have the same opportunities as anybody else, particularly in the realm of health. I think you have to view the ability to access appropriate sport, culturally appropriate, and also skillfully appropriate at the level that the individual wants to play at, as a part of that. And that if one group in Canada is being disproportionately prevented from participating in the primary setting for physical activity, that's a human rights violation.
And yet, you know, so you
yeah.
keep saying it was supposed to be, and yet we still just see the stalling, the dragging, the avoiding, and we'll get to that. We'll talk about some of the systemic strategies, I'd call them, for interfering with the upholding of human rights. Ige, tell us more about what you think, what your
Yeah,
experience
I
is.
think just to build on what Mac and Minky have said, I think the short answer would be that the right to sport would be a derivative right, derivative of the right to healthcare, the right to education, and the cultural rights. I think the international legal frameworks, within the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, there is a mention of play and recreation. And then within the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, sport is actually called out specifically as a right. So there is this broad framework that we can kind of pull upon. And I think the opportunity that provides is that if, and Canada has ratified the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous peoples, that provides us an opportunity to advocate for developing the systems that would enable the realization of these rights. And so if we look at sort of the top level international sphere and what the frameworks are, how do we take this and apply it to a policy perspective? And how do we take it and apply it to a program perspective? If you're running a program, or as Minky Worden said, if you're running a gym, how do you take this approach? And it's, the rights-based approach and the principles within there could provide you an avenue that would center dignity. And before moving on, maybe just a little bit of time on the concept of dignity as well. It is an inherent concept that everyone has dignity by simply being a human being. It is universal, it is inalienable, and it is non-negotiable, right? So when we think about human rights, this is effectively the why of the actual frameworks that we're discussing. And the what is the conditions that we seek to protect and fulfill dignity for all individuals. And so in order to dignity requires action and an intentionality. When you look at our name, Play for Dignity, it is very intentional, right? It is a verb, it is a call to action. And dignity is not automatically upheld. It must be actively protected in the way in which our systems are built and the way decisions are made. Without intentional design and safeguards, we risk violating others' dignity through exclusion, abuse, or even neglect. So the International Human Rights Framework provides a pathway to be able to get there. It is effectively the how when we think about dignity. They help to translate the ideal of dignity into law, policy, and accountability. And so if you are, at an organization or even at a community club, how does this sort of 30,000-foot level discussion impact you? Well, a rights-based approach takes shape through, an acronym I sort of come back to, which is PANEL, right? Participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and legality. So they can be used as design principles for programs or for policy. And if you go through each of them and you think about participation, are those who are most marginalized around the table when decisions are made. And when you think about accountability, what mechanisms are in place to ensure that when you make a commitment, you actually follow through on, and that there is actually a way for those who are rights holders, who are empowered to be able to advocate for their own rights. Non-discrimination, ensuring that by design, the programs that you are running are inclusive, and not only as a checkbox mechanism, but actually ensuring that people have decision-making power, voice, and influence. And legality, right? Drawing from this international legal framework, but again, ensuring there's a process for remedy if something goes wrong. So I think, sometimes when we discuss human rights, the right to sport, rights in sport, the conversation can feel like it's way above your head. And, some of the responses I've gotten are typically, oh, why aren't you doing this work in Africa or in Asia? Really thinking and conflating the idea of civil and political rights with social and economic rights. And so there is there are frameworks and pathways that can help us design systems that allow and enable the dignity of every individual to be realized, right?
Yeah, love it. That baking it in, embedding, making sure by design that we're actually going to be forced to uphold, and or at least those who are experiencing harm can point directly to or see the pathway to ensuring that they can advocate for themselves. Yeah, thank you. And Minky, you had some more to say. I think you were kind of clapping and cheering Ige on, but tell us more about why you agree as well with integrating it with law and policy.
Yeah, Ige put it much better than I did, but these are intrinsic rights, and people shouldn't have to fight for them. But I think we've also seen that sport, one of your earlier questions, Jennifer, was why essentially, why do people love sports? Why is it such a powerful platform? I think maybe now is a good time also to talk about sports as a platform for civil rights and human rights, and why through history we can all name favorite athletes, whether it's the Black Power salute at the 1968 Olympics, whether it's Billie Jean King fighting for equal pay, whether it's Indigenous athletes prevailing against enormous odds. I think there are lots of, one of the reasons we love sports is it's a David and Goliath story very often, with both by giving a platform to know and understand stories that we should know better, or giving rights holders a chance to talk about what their human rights are. And I think we can't, very often. I'm thinking of a very specific case here, but there was a young man named Hakeem Al Arabi who had played for the Bahraini national football team, soccer team, and was part of a public protest, was arrested, tortured, and imprisoned. He escaped and ended up in Australia, got refugee status, and then went on his honeymoon in Thailand and ended up captured under a illegitimate red notice. That's a long windup to say, when Human Rights Watch reached him in the Thai prison where he was sitting, very surprised that his honeymoon had been interrupted by this red notice to send him home to Bahrain, where he would likely never be seen again, as a government critic. He when we reached him, he didn't actually know that he had rights as an athlete. He didn't know that he had the human right of free speech. He didn't know that that FIFA had adopted a human rights policy. And he didn't really know what the avenues were that he could seek freedom and redress. And, eventually, with a lot of pressure, FIFA was monitoring his trial. Government officials, OHCHR, were sitting in the courtroom when he was brought in shackles. This talented athlete shackled at the legs is a picture a lot of people won't forget. And he was ultimately freed through political pressure. But it's really hard to access your rights if you don't know what they are. So I do think for many years, the sport movement has told athletes and fans and others, you don't have rights. We control sport. But if you think about it, if you turn it upside down, there is no sport without athletes. There's no money to be made without fans. So I think the biggest challenge is going to be all of the rights holders being able to access the rights they intrinsically have, but that are very often denied by governments, corporations, or federations.
Right, absolutely. And so what is it that what factors are at play that makes sport exempt? What are you're talking about some of the things, even I'm thinking about normalization, like it just becomes normalized that you're sort of this almost a pawn in the game instead of like those kids Mac was talking about way at the beginning, that we just know how to play and we're going to start a game, we create it. But then you start getting into more organized sport and you become something that's just a play thing. What's going on? What else do you see that prevents those rights from being realized, from being protected as they should be, from being taught so that athletes actually understand? So many of them just not getting the fact that if they just organize and link arms, they'd have all the power in the world.
I might just add one thing that, again, is from lessons from research, and that is it's exceptionalism. That although sport is rules-based, the human rights rules do not and have not applied in sport. And that's the biggest problem. There's been an exception for sport. The idea that I'll put a link to our Japan work, it literally, the research, the title of it was, I was hit so many times I can't count. The idea was that physical and corporal abuse of children was totally acceptable in order to win gold medals at the Olympics. So that sport exceptionalism is a constant problem. And the idea that anything is, you've certainly seen it in Canada, that any abuse is acceptable in the name of bringing home medals and trophies. So I'll put that in the chat, but wanted to tee that up for Mac and Ige.
Yeah. Oh God, and we could just keep going, right? Why is it win at all costs? Why are medals so important? Why is it, this whole concept of it's necessary to make you tough. Oh my God, craziness. Mac, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been thinking a little bit about kind of the structure of governance at the highest levels of sport, and the possibilities for change that are out there. Especially because, I think if sport was a truly democratic place and that the highest offices of sport were treated as a true democracy, and that if we had representation that was more maybe we voted for our representative. If the IOC is such a big grand thing and we're going to maintain it and continue on holding the Olympics as they are, we should probably have an elected official sent to represent the people of Canada, rather than a sporting careerist who's been there forever. Not taking a shot at anybody in particular, just speaking broadly. Because I think if the people were able to actually have a voice and a say in who represented them, and were able to send somebody and say, like, no, we don't want sport to be like this. And we know that there is a tremendous amount of pressure on athletes to walk a fine line between being, exercising their responsibilities as humans to stand up for their fellow athletes, and call out things that are wrong. But then there's an awful lot of pressure to not say too much, not go too far, so that all of a sudden you get pushed out of sport. And something that you've committed your whole life to is just taken away from you, because in many instances the options for meaningful redress aren't fully available to everybody. This can happen at a very young age. It doesn't have to happen at the elite level. You can want to blow the whistle on a coach who's mistreating athletes, and all of a sudden you're just not a member of the club anymore. And it can be pretty grim.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it gets at I think Minky is absolutely right in this sort of exceptionalism and autonomy of sport. If you have challenges within your sport, you should set up processes and, internal processes and tribunals to deal with those that are somewhat removed from the actual law of the land in many cases. So a lot of countries have taken this approach, and that's been at the root of a lot of challenges. It also goes back to how, as a society, we view and value sport, right? If it is a nice to have, if it is about entertainment, if it is about, a product, then these structures and the way we've organized things, sure, okay, right? But if we shift it as, about a right, but also that, as an individual, you have the right to your dignity in sporting context as well. And there are laws that need to be followed, domestically, to be able to ensure your protection on that. Then these structures, we can start to pull them apart as well. But if we also dig a little bit deeper and ask the question of, well, why have we gone down this road, and why have some countries accepted this, and there is this sort of, what are the incentive structures that are at play here that allow certain behavior not only to take place, but to be entrenched, so that we get into a point of, cyclical crises. A lot of the headlines in Canada that you would have seen in 2020, and you still see today in the news, it's not the first time we've seen these. They just happen to come out in cycles. And that incentive structure goes to how we fund our sport ecosystem, how we govern the sport ecosystem. And we need to ensure that these are aligned with human rights, right? Whether it's the right to sport, if we need to funnel more funding towards that, rights in sport, safety, or using sport as a tool for social and economic development, and for the enablement of the achievement of other social and economic rights, education, health, cultural rights, etc. So I think, that's really getting at the, okay, why, being able to ask that question and pull this apart. I mean, it's I say it as if it's simple, but I think, it's kind of the beginning of the work to understand why things are the way they are, so that we can start to use the frameworks that we have in front of us to build those systems that enable the realization of rights, not to entrench systems that deny rights and cause harm.
Yeah, and the value of delivering sport in a way that is healthy, safe, developmental, good for society, human and social development. It seems so obvious to us. But what gets in the way? It was interesting, Minky, when you were talking about how it's a workplace. And there are laws governing workplaces. I hear that all the time from the athletes, right? Like, this wouldn't happen at work. This would be treated differently at work. And why is it different in sport? And, we talked about exceptionalism and that it's thought to need to be autonomous. I think that's a myth, right? That gets meted often across the ecosystem that protects only some people's rights. Yeah. But so in some ways, the economic framework can really be helpful, but then it's also the incentives, the money, the power imbalance that creates can also be preventing us from going down the path of actual protection, people's rights. What's our biggest challenge, do you think, in conquering this?
I will maybe kick the floor. I'm aware that we have so many experts in the room with us who have both lived experience as athletes, including elite athletes, but also lived experiences in different human rights contexts. But just to pick up on something that Ige said, this framework is really what we have to return to. And Jennifer, I loved you saw in your opening set of your setup slides, you had a picture of the German national team wearing the t-shirts that said spelled out human rights. And we don't so if we think back to that moment, that was before the Qatar World Cup, and they were protesting thousands of preventable worker deaths building the stadiums that they were going to have to play in, no choice, and the lack of LGBT rights in Qatar. And actually, their protests fell on deaf ears. I mean, they did not, their protests did not achieve any meaningful change. And so I fear now that there is less appetite to fight in the current setting. And I'm going to go ahead and point out that, for example, the pernicious immigration laws that are being put in place by the Trump administration in advance of the US, Canada, and Mexico's World Cup. This was supposed to be the largest and most inclusive World Cup in the ever, 48 teams, literally the largest, but also the most inclusive, the first across 3 countries. Does anyone think that with students being apprehended and deported, with teenage tourists being interrogated, jailed, and strip searched, does anyone think this is turning out to be an inclusive World Cup in the United States, at least? And I would also point to the Olympics and coming up in Los Angeles at a time when, after the fires, it already had one of the worst unhoused population crises in the United States. And now I read a news story today that there are going to be laws essentially outlawing being homeless, right? So if you have no home, that is now outlawed without any economic support. So I think we have both the lessons from the past, but a need to really roll forward and see how sport can be a lever of change in this exact moment, how athletes and others can find their voices and really confront some of these very profound changes to the underlying environment the underlying human rights environment that's the main finding of our work for 30 years is when the human rights environment is bad in a host nation, it will inevitably affect and sometimes cause catastrophic human rights abuses. So I think, we also are at a moment where the movement has a lot of work to do, especially in relation to upcoming mega events, both making sure those events are safe for athletes, fans, journalists, and others, but also, is there a way that these events could provide leverage to make human rights policies less bad?
The events themselves, yeah. Take some.
And just as
information.
a note of an example here, I think, to reiterate Minky's point here, that no rights are in isolation, right? We're talking about sport, the right to sport, rights in sport, but you can't have one right and not another, right? So there's this principle that I think when we talk about all of the other issues around mega sporting events that we really need to take into account. And we've seen, examples even in Paris with sort of unhoused being cleared ahead of the Olympics. And so if we are sports fans, administrators, those who are sort of working in the ecosystem, we need to understand how that the hosting of these things impacts the communities that are being hosted. And so some of the work that we're doing ahead of the World Cup is looking at our policy framework in Canada to say, what safeguards are there in Canada's hosting policy around human rights? Explicitly, there's nothing right now. We have a policy, the 2008 hosting policy, and it doesn't require human rights risk assessments and other tools explicitly. So what we're doing with our partners in Toronto, and we're reaching out to Vancouver as well, is to ask, what are those risks? How is community seeing this event coming up, and what recommendations do we need to put forward to ensure that there is a policy legacy of this games, that future games must safeguard rights both of athletes, but also of the communities in which these games are hosted. And so it's taking those opportunities and ensuring that there is a lens, a human rights lens and analysis and risk assessment on these opportunities and endeavors.
I guess I'll talk to more the national level, because that's kind of been where I've been focused for the last couple of years. I think, although we've had all of these studies conducted by the government and publicly available through the House of Commons, there seems to still be a real hesitance to just listen to survivors of human rights abuses in sport in Canada, and actually listen in a meaningful way so that you're actually taking some kind of action based on what they say. They're not just being trotted up to tell their story and then sent away, and then you don't do anything. It makes it feel like something's been done, but nothing has changed. And it's incredibly frustrating. And I don't know what else to say about it really, because this is one of those points like you were talking about, Jen, where you reach this point of frustration where it doesn't make any sense that people would not just do this, or people would not want to intervene. And why aren't they? Well, is it just simply a matter of politics? The political realists out there who think politics is somehow separate from everything else in society, and they can do what they need to do to get their political agendas done in Ottawa. Well, that's not the case for everybody else. When everybody else is just trying to get along and enjoy something that they probably love or used to love, and they can't. And when they blow the whistle, they often lose access to the sport. Or if they blow the whistle and they are given a platform in Ottawa, like happened recently, and you're told there's going to be this grand solution, that something's coming. One sport minister even said there's going to be a national inquiry, and then the sport minister changes, and all of a sudden the new sport minister doesn't want a national inquiry. Well, what does that mean? What changed? Nothing changed. But the political priorities obviously did. So on the ground in Canada, I feel like there's still so much work to be done. So many people suffering because of sport, not necessarily feeling that warm, I love this sport and it brings me nothing but good memories and my childhood. For every person like that, there's probably another person that does not feel that way at all. And to speak to what my colleagues have been saying is, there are human rights mechanisms in place that we can entrench in our laws. especially with the rights of the child, Canada has constantly been whacked on the knuckles for not taking a more proactive approach to, enshrining the principles of the rights of children in the law. It's one of our weaker areas, I think. So there are things we can do at that level that would draw from the international and have a major impact, I think, at the national level and then on down to provincial, municipal. Um, it's just finding a way to stoke that appetite for change and finding leaders who are willing to take some risks and take some criticism if it means protecting people.
An enormous amount of energy is going into preserving what is, hey? From what you said about the optics instead of ethics, let's just, trot them out, and at least it looks like we're doing things for as long as possible, stall. What are they protecting? What are they preserving? Is it jobs? Is it their jobs, their reputation? Where is all this energy coming from to preserve the status quo when it's so obvious that we need to change? I work in the world of culture and communication. Cultural change really starts with calling out the governing assumptions beneath, right? And I really think, I've heard it from athletes so many times, they're just protecting their jobs. And I always thought that was kind of simplistic, but the more I listen to you all, I think maybe that's all it is, hey? Their money and their jobs, the career risks. What do you think?
I just want to pick up on, what Mac was saying, and tie it back to our conversation. I think, given where we are in discussing, sport and human rights, this framework provides us really a mobilizing force. I think we need to be able to look at the different issues, whether it's access, safety, inclusion, and really start to put them forward as human rights issues. When someone is abused, their rights have been violated. When they are excluded, their rights have been violated. When organizations deny them from expressing themselves, their rights have been violated. So from an organizing perspective, I think there's a huge opportunity here, because what you often hear when you think about the issues in sport are the voices who have been around for a long time, right? So that's one piece there. I think the resistance to change, to answer your question, or attempt to answer your question, this is not the solution per se, but perhaps just a perspective on trying to understand that. I think it goes back to incentives, and the incentive structure is, the more you win, the more money that you have, and the more funding that you have, therefore your jobs, etc., and everything else is protected. And but if we think about that in the current way that the sport ecosystem is set up, you get a sense that is a very much a scarcity approach, right? It is a zero-sum approach, right? If I change the way I'm doing things, that means I lose. It's win or lose. And that kind of goes back, sorry to kind of maybe go a little bit theoretical here. If we look at the sport economy, and if we think about sport as an economy and say, okay, well, what would it look like as an economy? I think of oil and gas, forestry, fisheries, and other extractive economy. Because when you use language like talent development, and you're looking at that as a resource to draw from the community, because the purpose of winning medals is to do that, is to develop talent and pull it out from the community. And that is to say that, yes, there are harms as a result of these types of economies, and we see that in sport very much. And so that isn't to say that there isn't a better way to do that. When you have extractive economies that cause harm to the communities that have the resources, often you can move to a regenerative economy. And so what would a regenerative sport economy look like? How could we think about the incentive structures to be able to support sort of the positive outcomes that we all know sport is possible of producing. And so I think, one is this idea that like the pie is small and I've got to keep, the pie, rather than sort of thinking, let's take the Canadian example. Sport is funded out of Heritage Canada and there are limited dollars there. But if we're thinking about sport and its connection to health and wellness, social and economic development, we can open up new resources that enlarge the pie, right? So there's a bit of thinking outside of the box that's required, but I think, often and always keeping in mind this rights-based approach and ensuring that that is the design tool that we have for what we hope and where we hope sport to go.
Blue ocean. Minky, go.
I love Ige's vision, and I think he should be put in charge of a lot of this. No one in Canada ever consults me about anything. But that positive vision, I think, is really important to keep in mind. And but I think we also have to have the reality check that, it's the right question. So what are and I love the word incentives, because I feel like that covers such a wealth of corruption and backroom dealing and non-transparent processes. So just to say, when we talk about incentives, there are incentives for the powerful, abusive men who run sport to stay in power. There are very few seats at the table for women and girls, even fewer for survivors in sport. My own view is if you're a survivor of abuse in sport, you go to the head of the line. And I think of these, so if we think of sport as this ecosystem, we have at the top the Olympic system and the IOC, and then underneath the national federations, and underneath that you have the national federations of the sport. So it's thousands of sport federations, thousands of jobs. Very few of these are occupied by women, girls, Indigenous people, athletes, survivors of abuse. I could, there are, and these are the people who have suffered the most to make sport better, and there's never a seat at the table for them. So I think that is the very first thing, is getting a seat at the table for those who have sacrificed the most to make sport better. I think another thing is the incentives that we're talking about. So Aramco, massive polluting entity, one of the world's richest companies, polluting the environment, has just become FIFA football's newest sponsor. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to a article, many women, more than 100 women professional footballers, lodged a protest letter with FIFA to say, you did not consult us about this. This is our game, and we don't want Aramco, polluting Aramco, to sponsor our sport, the Women's World Cup. So I think it's a very critical thing that the reason there's no change is there's so much money sloshing around, but it's not reaching the communities that, I'm actually aware of some of the really incredible work that's been happening in Toronto and other areas to involve the community in the World Cup. Guess what? That is not happening in other host cities. So Canada's objectively doing a better job than many other host cities because there's no pressure to do it. So it's, this was supposed to be the World Cup, the first one with a human rights policy, the first one with a child safeguarding policy. None of those, that it was awarded in 2018. FIFA's had since 2018 to put a child safeguarding policy in place, training, what to do if there's a lost child. It's just incredible, the failure to do this. So it's not a fail. It's a deliberate failure, because FIFA does not want a high bar for the US, Canada, and Mexico, and then no bar for Saudi Arabia, where women and girls still don't have basic rights, where workers will, thousands of workers at the lowest level will die delivering the World Cup in Saudi Arabia. So FIFA has gutted the human rights strategy for 2026 so that it doesn't look so bad when 2034 rolls around. So just to it's the right question to ask. There are no seats at the table, by and large, for women and girls, people of color, and those who don't come from great wealth, right? Plenty of seats for members of the royal family, and oil magnates, but very few seats for players, survivors, women, indigenous people, LGBT people, and para athletes. Sorry for the rant.
No, good rant. That's what we're here to do too. And how do we reconcile this sort of positive vision, which leverages people's kind of need for money, power, position, but also then shows that there's this whole blue ocean of that out there. Like there's a lot for everybody, and we can all still enjoy sport. It doesn't have to be limited to a few. How do we bring those things together? I know it's a big question, but this is probably one of the first webinars where I feel like we're actually heading down a path of some solutions. Like, yes, the pressure, obviously, again, in sport, pressure works, right? Best defense, good offense. But I mean, that's exhausting and it doesn't always work, and it's falling on deaf ears, kind of increasingly, it seems. So how about this new vision for what sport could be that actually leverages people's desire for money and power?
I do think there's some things we could do immediately in Canada while we work on bigger issues. And this may be controversial depending on who's on the call. I'm not sure. But there's no need for On the Podium to exist in Canada. I think, speaking of the dangers created by scarcity of funding, when you have an organization that is primarily used to determine who will be funded on the basis of medal potential, you're creating scarcity that doesn't have to exist. And my friend and colleague, coming back to the extractive industries example, which I think is a great one, Amanda Schweinbenz up at Laurentian University, she actually compares it to the nickel tax. Or the nickel bonus, sorry, that was used in Sudbury, where miners were paid more and more they could extract. So you go down into the mine, you bring more and more out. Of course, you're putting yourself in more and more danger. And the same argument, I think, could be made with sport. Like, maybe you don't report something you see. Maybe something happens to you and you're not willing to come forward because you know there is such a small amount of funding available at the very top, and that everybody is competing for it. So you're willing to accept far more risks than you ordinarily would be, based on the system that we have in place. And I think that if we just swept that away and kind of moved to some of the older models that we had already been doing, that kind of dispense with this process of trying to identify medal hopefuls and funding them more than everybody else, I think we can get around some of the dangers and embrace a more holistic view of what sport could be.
And balance power, hey, as soon as power's in balance, that's when we see everyone behaving terribly. And you started with that, Minky, around power relations and the amount of power that we see. I mean, sport is really about balancing that playing field so that we can have a contest that is, you know, striving together. You're actually working together to achieve things.
Picking up on what Max said, you know, there, and thinking about voice, whose voice is listened to in the sport ecosystem. Ahead of the 2024 Paris Olympics, there was a huge call for increased funding for Olympic sports from the Canadian Olympic Committee. And the reasoning or rationale was that, you know, participation will go down if we don't get $104 million to support those who are going to Paris in the Olympics. And, you know, I think you can make that case, sure, but to link it to participation is problematic because the data actually did not support that. And there's this work of Dr. Peter Connolly, who actually looked at funding, medals, and participation, and found that the more money that was invested in sport in Canada, the less people in Canada participated, and the more medals we won in Canada, the less people participated as well. And there's one key year in this graph that I sometimes put side by side, and that's 2004. And 2004 is when Own the Podium was created. And so, that's kind of just a bit of context, but I raise it only to point out that, what are the biggest voices, when it comes to advocacy? Those are the ones that tend to be listened to. And again, thinking about this conversation around human rights in terms of building power and thinking about it as a mobilizing force. Your question, Jen, is a big one, and I don't sort of it's not going to be easy, but I think how we start to think about changing it is perhaps through this concentric circles, right? So there are those organizations who are doing direct service delivery when it comes to ensuring those at the margins actually have an opportunity to participate in a safe environment. And so direct service could be one way to start to address this. From there, you go to enabling those organizations who are doing direct service, connecting them, ensuring that that they're able to deliver service better and scale their organization. Where it really does get to sort of generational work is this, thinking about kind of the framework, right? So we need to start to think about what it would take to change culture, whether it's education, and come together as an ecosystem to start to change the frameworks around how our sport ecosystem is viewed and valued, and be able to advocate for that. So I would approach it in that way. And some of the work that we're doing is the Future of Sport Commission has been listening in Canada, and we've been pushing forward the language of human rights in sport policy, the recognition for sport to be a right, and safety in sport to be a major component of our next policy framework. But we're also doing work at the grassroots to look at sport for development organizations who are using sport as a tool for community development, and providing them with support to be able to actually do a bottom-up approach, to be able to point to an example and say, this is what you can achieve when you embed human rights principles in sport, but then doing the policy work at the top in advocacy to push forward for change, and figuring out what the levers of change are. Policy is one, money is another. Funders need to be sort of held to account and sort of brought in as well. So I'll stop there, and but those are just initial thoughts on how we might start to address this.
Love that. And we're wrapping up, but last words. Love this idea of at all levels, all times, and we're all, yes, we're tired, but we also, if we're not working on it, then what are we doing, right? It's valiant work. What do you think? Last words, Minky? Advice you'd give to people who are...
I put this in the chat, but I think there was a question about the role of survivors. And I work a lot with athlete survivors of abuse who have actually taken up the job. It's a job to reform sports bodies. And we have some on the webinar here today. I wanted to particularly call out the great Kim Shore for her work, advancing change, not just in her sport, but in many. And I think, there are lots of reasons for hope for the future. One is that we could use sport as a lever for change more broadly in society, which is really a theme that Ige has been telling us about from the beginning. So how can we use sport as a positive lever for change? How can we do better? I mean, if you go back to every Olympics has decided to streak clean, since, there are terrible stories. You could look it up on the AP of street cleaning of children in the South Korean Olympics from 1988. the same from Beijing from 2008, the same from Paris last year. Are we really going to keep doing this for every are we going to keep forcing children and unhoused people out of their homes? Can't we do better than having migrant workers dying preventable deaths building stadiums in the desert? Yes, we absolutely can. And we have a series of events coming up in Canada, the US, North America that include, it's really a perfect storm, you could say, both the Men's World Cup for 2026 and the Olympics for 2028. So we have an opportunity for everyone to do better at a national level. But I really think good governance is the biggest challenge. And that means getting people into these jobs. And I would say every National Olympic Committee these are jobs. Why are women not welcome in these jobs? Why are all the federations run by men by and large? And if there's a woman running the federation like US Soccer, it's because she replaced a man who who was not up to the job, right? But I would say we have lots of opportunities on the horizon. This type of forum is amazing to brainstorm about making, sports should be associated chiefly with human achievement, chiefly with dignity, chiefly with elevating the voices of athletes, of fans, of journalists, and others. And we can still do that. So I do think we have opportunities on the horizon, and I look forward to working with everyone to make the most of them.
Love this, and I'll give the last words to Mac, but I'm just kind of summarizing this idea of getting people at the table because governance is so critical. That's where a lot of the corruption's happening, and lack of accountability, transparency, representation make me crazy. The pressure has to be continued, but they're looking for intentional opportunities to galvanize people at events and through forums like the Future of Sport. I know tons of people who've gone many, many times to that table to make sure they're really hearing. There's some good people at the table listening, I think. What else, Mac? What would you advise people to be putting their energy into as we battle?
I would just say, don't be afraid to put forward radical ideas about a better future for sport. It's frowned upon in many corners because we are so entrenched in the way we have done things. But I do think that personally, anyway, that the future cannot be safer and more humane under the systems we have. And I know that's drastic, but I don't. So long as the FIFA exists, corruption, exploitation, extractive processes, human trafficking, all of this is going to come with soccer. And people will say, well, what are you going to do? You can't get rid of FIFA. That's impossible. Well, there's lots of things we didn't think we could get rid of, and we have. But then I guess once we get to a point, maybe someday, where we have something new and different, making sure that we don't do the same things all over again. One of the most depressing things you see around the world is when the oppressed become the oppressors. And so many people have wrote about it. There seems to be something about us as humans where we tend to drift in that direction and use the tools that were used against us. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And I think if we go into this fight for a safer, more humane sporting culture, which is going to be global regardless, that's the way it is now. With our eyes open and our commitment to making things truly different and different over the long haul, and not reverting back to the way we were, we can do that. Maybe it'll take 100 years, but
Well, maybe not. Culture change doesn't have to take that long. And I think, I love that vision, like not be afraid to imagine. Isn't that what sport teaches us? Again, I just circle right back to sport, the possibility and that orientation to possibility is what is what we're actually protecting, right? In trying to make sure that sport is delivered with a human rights mindset. Thank you all. Wow, that was a really, they always are great, but I really appreciate you all coming and such good insight, encouragement. I feel like I got a bit more energy back, you know, and this I think is very powerful because we're educating, right? We're constantly trying to share, educate, empower people to come together and keep up the good fight. Thank you and take care, and we'll be following you all. Thank you for all your resources and links that you've shared and your brilliance. And I'm really grateful for all the work that each of you are doing in the world. Take care.